Operation Menu was the codename of a covert United States Strategic Air Command bombing campaign conducted in eastern Cambodia and Laos from 18 March 1969 until 26 May 1970. During the Vietnam War, the targets of these attacks were sanctuaries and base areas of the People's Army of Vietnam and forces of the Viet Cong, which utilized them for resupply, training, and resting between campaigns across the border in the Republic of Vietnam. The impact of the bombing campaign on the Khmer Rouge guerrillas, the PAVN, and Cambodian civilians in the bombed areas is disputed by historians. An official United States Air Force record of U.S. bombing activity over Indochina from 1964 to 1973 was declassified by U.S. President Bill Clinton in 2000. The report gives details of the extent of the bombing of Cambodia, as well as of Laos and Vietnam. According to the data, the Air Force began bombing the rural regions of Cambodia along its South Vietnam border in 1965 under the Johnson administration. This was 4 years earlier than previously believed. The Menu bombings were an escalation of what had previously been tactical air attacks. Newly inaugurated President Richard Nixon authorized for the first time use of long-range B-52 heavy bombers to carpet-bomb Cambodia. Operation Freedom Deal followed Operation Menu. B-52 bombing was expanded to a much larger area of Cambodia and continued until August 1973. Background: from the onset of hostilities in South Vietnam and the Kingdom of Laos in the early 1960s, Cambodia's Prince Norodom Sihanouk had maintained a delicate domestic and foreign policy balancing act. Convinced of the inevitable victory of the Communists in Southeast Asia and concerned for the future existence of his government, Sihanouk swung toward the left in the mid-1960s. In 1966, Sihanouk made an agreement with Zhou Enlai of the People's Republic of China that would allow PAVN and NLF forces to establish base areas in Cambodia and to use the port of Sihanoukville for the delivery of military material. The U.S., heavily involved in South Vietnam, was not eager to openly violate the asserted neutrality of Cambodia, which had been guaranteed by the Geneva Accord of 1954. Beginning in 1967, President Lyndon B. Johnson authorized covert reconnaissance operations by the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The mission of the highly classified unit was to obtain military intelligence on the base areas that would be presented to Sihanouk in hopes of changing his position. By late 1968, Sihanouk, under pressure from the political right at home and from the U.S., agreed to more normalized relations with the Americans. In July 1968, he had agreed to reopen diplomatic relations and, in August, formed a government of national salvation under the pro-U.S. General On Nol. Newly inaugurated President Richard M. Nixon, seeking any means by which to withdraw from Southeast Asia and obtain peace with honor, saw an opening with which to give time for the U.S. withdrawal, and time to implement the new policy of Vietnamization. Before the diplomatic amenities with Sihanouk were even concluded, Nixon had decided to deal with the situation of PAVN troops and supply bases in Cambodia. He had already considered a naval blockade of the Cambodian coast, but was talked out of it by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who believed that Sihanouk could still be convinced to agree to ground attacks against the base areas. On 30 January 1969, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Earl Wheeler had suggested to the President that he authorize the bombing of the Cambodian sanctuaries. He was seconded on 9 February by the U.S. Commander in Vietnam, General Creighton W. Abrams, who also submitted his proposal to bomb the Central Office of South Vietnam, the elusive headquarters of PAVN, NLF Southern Operations. located somewhere in the Fish Hook region of eastern Cambodia. On the 22nd of February, during the period just following the Tet holidays, PAVN, NLF forces launched an offensive. Nixon became even more angered when the Communists launched rocket and artillery attacks against Saigon, which he considered a violation of the agreement he believed had been made when the U.S. halted the bombing of North Vietnam in November 1968. Nixon, who was en route to Brussels for a meeting with North Atlantic Treaty Organization leaders, ordered his national security advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger, to prepare for air strikes against PAVN, NLF base areas in Cambodia as a reprisal. The bombings were to serve three purposes. It would show Nixon's tenacity, it would disable PAVN's offensive capability to disrupt the U.S. withdrawal and Vietnamization, and it would demonstrate the U.S.'s determination. That might pay dividends at the negotiating table in Paris. He then cabled Colonel Alexander Haig, a National Security Council staff aide, to meet him in Brussels along with Colonel Raymond B. Sitton, a former Strategic Air Command officer on the JCS staff, to formulate a plan of action. By seeking advice from high administration officials, Nixon had delayed any quick response that could be explicitly linked to the provocation. He decided to respond to the next provocation and didn't have to wait long. On the 14th of March, Communist forces once again attacked South Vietnam's urban areas and Nixon was ready. Breakfast. In his diary in March 1969, Nixon's chief of staff, R. Haldeman, noted that the final decision to carpet bomb Cambodia was made at a meeting in the Oval Office Sunday afternoon, after the church service. In his diary on the 17th of March 1969, Haldeman wrote, "Historic day. K. Kissinger's Operation Breakfast finally came off at 2 p.m. our time. K. really excited, as is P. resident. And the next day, K's Operation Breakfast, a great success. He came beaming in with the report, very productive, a lot more secondaries than had been expected, confirmed early intelligence. Probably no reaction for a few days, if ever." The bombing began on the night of the 18th of March with a raid by 60 B-52 Stratofortress bombers, based at Andersen Air Force Base, Guam. The target was Base Area 353, the supposed location of COSVN in the Fish Hook. Although the aircrews were briefed that their mission was to take place in South Vietnam, 48 of the bombers were diverted across the Cambodian border and dropped 2,400 tons of bombs. The mission was designated Breakfast, after the morning Pentagon planning session at which it was devised. Breakfast was so successful that General Abrams provided a list of 15 more known base areas for targeting. The 5 remaining missions and targets were lunch, snack, dinner, supper, and dessert. SAC flew 3,800 B-52 sorties against these targets, and dropped 108,823 tons of ordnance during the missions. Due to the continued reference to meals in the code names, the entire series of missions was referred to as Operation Menu. Studies and Observations Group Forward Air Controllers of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam provided 70% of the menu bomb damage intelligence. Nixon and Kissinger went to great lengths to keep the mission secret. The expansion of the U.S. effort into neutral Cambodia was sure to cause serious debate in the U.S. Congress, negative criticism in the media, and were sure to spark anti-war protests on American college campuses. In order to prevent this, an elaborate dual reporting system covering the missions had been formulated during the Brussels meeting between Nixon, Haig, and Colonel Sitton. System. The number of individuals who had complete knowledge of the operation was kept to a minimum. All communications concerning the missions was split along 2 paths. One route was overt, ordering typical B-52 missions that were to take place within South Vietnam near the Cambodian border. The second route was covert, utilizing back-channel messages between commanders ordering the classified missions. For example, General Abrams would request a menu strike. His request went to Admiral John S. McCain, Jr., the Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Command, in Honolulu. McCain forwarded it to the Joint Chiefs in Washington, D.C., who, after reviewing it, passed it on to Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird. The Joint Chiefs then passed the command for the strike to General Bruce K. Holloway, commander of SAC, who then notified Lieutenant General Alvin C. Gillum, commander of the 3rd Air Division on Guam. During this time Air Force Major Hal Knight was supervising an MSQ-77 combat Skysport radar site at Bien Hoa Air Base, RVN. Skysport was a ground-directed bombing system which directed B-52 strikes to targets in Vietnam. Each day a courier plane would arrive from SAC's Advanced Echelon Office at Tan Son Nhut Air Base near Saigon. Knight was given a revised list of target coordinates for the next day's missions. That evening, the coordinates were fed into Olivetti Programmer 101 computers, and then relayed to the aircraft as they came on station. Only the pilots and navigators of the aircraft knew of the true location of the targets. The bombers then flew onto their targets and delivered their payloads. After the airstrikes, Knight gathered the mission paperwork, computer tapes etc., destroying them in an incinerator. He then called a special phone number in Saigon and reported that, "The ball game is over." The aircrews filled out routine reports of hours flown, fuel burned, and ordnance dropped. This dual system maintained secrecy and provided Air Force logistics and personnel administrators with information that they needed to replace air crews or aircraft and replenish stocks of fuel and munitions. Exposure. Although Sihanouk was not informed by the U.S. about the operation, he may have had a desire to see PAVN, NLF forces out of Cambodia, since he himself was precluded from pressing them too hard. After the event, it was claimed by Nixon and Kissinger that Sihanouk had given his tacit approval for the raids. Peter Rodman claimed, "Prince Sihanouk complained bitterly to us about these North Vietnamese bases in his country and invited us to attack them." In December 1967, Washington Post journalist Stanley Carnow was told by Sihanouk that if the U.S. wanted to bomb the Vietnamese communist sanctuaries, he would not object, unless Cambodians were killed. The same message was conveyed to U.S. President Johnson's emissary Chester Bowles in January 1968. Sihanouk publicly condemned the bombing. On 9 May 1969, an article by military reporter William M. Beecher exposing the bombing was run in the New York Times. Beecher claimed that an unnamed source within the administration had provided the information. Nixon was furious when he heard the news and ordered Kissinger to obtain the assistance of Federal Bureau of Investigation Director J. Edgar Hoover and discover the source of the leak. Hoover suspected Kissinger's own NSC aide, Morton Halperin, of the deed and so informed Kissinger. Halperin's phone was then illegally tapped for 21 months. This was the first in a series of illegal surveillance activities authorized by Nixon in the name of national security. The administration was relieved when no other significant press reports concerning the operation appeared. By the summer, 5 members of the United States Congress had been informed of the operation. They were Senators John C. Stennis and Richard B. Russell, Jr., and Representatives Lucius Mendel Rivers, Gerald R. Ford, and Leslie C. Arins. For those in Washington who were cognizant of the menu raids, the silence of one party came as a surprise. The Hanoi government made no protest concerning the bombings. It neither denounced the raids for propaganda purposes, nor, according to Kissinger, Did its negotiators raise the matter during formal or secret negotiations? North Vietnam had no wish to advertise the presence of their forces in Cambodia, allowed by Sihanouk in return for the Vietnamese agreeing not to foment rebellion in Cambodia. Revelations. For 4 years Menu remained unknown to the U.S. Congress as a whole, although as previously mentioned 5 congressmen had been informed. That situation changed in December 1972, when Major Knight wrote a letter to Senator William Proxmire, asking for clarification as to U.S. policy on the bombing of Cambodia. Knight, who had become concerned over the legality of his actions, had complained to his superior officer, Colonel David Patterson. He then received several bad efficiency reports, which ruined his career, and he had been discharged from the Air Force. Proxmire's further questioning led to hearings of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which eventually demanded that the Department of Defense turn over all records of U.S. air operations in Cambodia. When they arrived, the records did not even mention the Menu strikes. The committee was not convinced and the investigation continued. Less than 2 weeks later, it opened hearings on the nomination of General George S. Brown for the position of Chief of Staff of the Air Force. As commander of the 7th Air Force in South Vietnam, Brown had been privy to Menu and disclosed as much to the committee. The committee uncovered excuses and deceptions that were perhaps more alarming than those occurring simultaneously in the Watergate hearings. The Menu revelations raised fundamental questions as to military discipline and honesty, of civilian control over the military and of congressional effectiveness. It was basically agreed, both by Congress and concerned military officers, that the deception employed during Menu went beyond covertness. According to Air Force historian Captain Earl H. Tilford, deception to fool the enemy was one thing, but lying to Congress and key members of the government, including the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force, was something else. Civilian casualties. There are no confirmed estimates of Cambodians killed, wounded, or rendered homeless by Operation Menu. The Department of Defense estimated that the 6 areas bombed in Operation Menu had a non-combatant population of 4,247. Planners stated that the surprise effect of attacks could tend to increase casualties, as could the probable lack of protective shelters around Cambodian homes. Each of the target areas was small. Area 353 was only 25 square kilometers in size and had an estimated population of 1,640 people. B-52s flew 228 sorties into this single area to bomb. Each B-52 can carry up to 108 bombs weighing 225 kilograms and spread them equally over a box about 1.5 kilometer long by 1/2 kilometer wide. Thus, nearly 25,000 bombs may have been dropped in Area 353 alone. The other target areas had similar saturation rates of bombs.